welcome to the session. We're just allowing a moment for everyone to come in, and then we will begin today's webinar. Warm welcome to those who are already here. Just allowing all the delegates to arrive into the session, and then we'll begin. Hello to those who've already joined, just giving a couple more seconds to allow people to come through the gateway. And we will start very shortly. Okay, hello and welcome to today's session. I'm Rachel Reed, Director of Insight here at ETOA. I am delighted to be joined today by Edmund Morris of Equator. So hello to you, Edmund.
Hey, Rachel. Nice to be here.
This is our first webinar together, so very much looking forward to seeing what you have to tell us today, and hopefully we'll have more in the future. So as it says on the tin, we're going to be talking about AI and the future of travel data. And we speak a lot in our industry about applications of AI, and we tend to think of it on the customer-facing and business efficiency side. I guess that's what we speak about most. But today we're going to have a look at another aspect to AI, and I think one that is very exciting and potentially very impactful for our industry, is to dive into new data sources and build models so that we can understand visitor behaviour in destination. Edmund is going to relate that to the hot topics really of 2025, particularly around overcrowding and visitor management. So really looking forward to seeing all of your new work on that. And it is very new, a lot of this stuff. Some of it, I believe, isn't even available yet. Is that right, Edmund?
Yeah. Some of the stuff will be showcased for you for the first time. We'll also be hinting at some things we're beginning to see in trends that we haven't published yet, but I think are likely. So they're high probability, but I'll get into that in a minute.
Great, fantastic. So just before he does, a couple of housekeeping points. We will put the webinar up on the Insight Hub as usual, and we'll also send you a link to the recording afterwards. So feel free to forward that to any colleagues who missed it. Do also ask any questions via the Q&A facility, and we'll pick up on those either as we go through or at the end, depending how we go with timings. And so with that, I will hand over to Edmund.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. So for those that never heard of me, don't know anything about me or Equator, my name's Edmund. I am based in Perth, Australia. Founded Equator in 2021. I'll get into why we founded Equator actually in the presentation, bizarrely halfway through. But just on my background, I actually come from economic development and humanitarian work. I spent 10 years working for the US government in poverty alleviation and impact modeling, and then went on to do some advisory work for Fortune 500 companies on sustainability. And then right before COVID, I founded Equator, which is a great time to found a tourism company, but things worked out. And here I am. So it's a pleasure to be with you all. So I'm going to sort of jump straight into this a little bit. I actually can't see any questions on the screen. So if you do have questions and they need to be addressed immediately, Rachel, I'd kindly ask if you could just interrupt and say, Ed, there's like a question on this specific graph or topic. Can we get into it? And I'm more than happy to do that.
Will.
So,
yes, I will.
Fantastic. So before we kind of jump like deep into like the data we're analyzing and like the utility of the AI, the two kind of fundamental things I kind of want to talk about here is the kind of convergence of crises that are going to dictate the future of travel and tourism. The first is fairly self-evident. It's climate change. I'm not going to jump into graphs and charts demonstrating that this is an important topic. I'm not a climate scientist. There are millions of examples of it, but it is a massive force that will also determine how, why, and when we use data. But the second one, which I think is probably less understood, is over tourism, or the acceleration of growth taking place in travel and tourism. The reason I think this is so poorly understood is the utility of this graph here, which is tourist arrivals. I hate this graph for many reasons, but the main reason I hate it is it tells us what we already know. It tells you that there were more tourists today than there were 75 years ago, which is, helpful, but it doesn't really explain why there were more tourists. And when you know why there were more tourists, the problem of over tourism becomes a lot kind of sharper in focus. So in order to explain over tourism and the kind of broader problem it presents and why I think it's going to be a critical defining issue for travel and tourism for ever, essentially, comes down to this graph here, which is an income population graph produced by the team at Gapminder that we've adapted by Equator. Um, Essentially, the mountains you see, the pink and the gray ones, this is people, right? And the bottom axis here from 0.2 to $500, that's income per day. So where that mountain is placed shows you where most people are. So as of 1990, the vast majority of the world were earning around $2 a day. And there were kind of two little humps. You had in gray, the West, that's the wealthiest countries in the world, and the pink, you had the rest of the world. And the part that we're really interested in is the part in orange on the right-hand side here. And this is the people who can afford to travel. So 1990, there are about 140 million people who can afford to travel. What happens as we go forward in time, you can see that mountain starts to shift. The world gets a lot wealthier. Incomes go up. And by 23, 25, the people who can afford to travel is now at 400 million people. And when we go into the next generation of travel, it gets very, very evident what's coming next. And that is that the total population of people who can afford to travel within the next 25 years is going to go from 400 million to 800 million. And that might sound a lot, but as of right now, it's about 5% of the world's population. It's 400 million people. And it's likely going to double to a record-breaking 800 million. And this doesn't mean tourist arrivals. This is the universe of your market, right? So this is every potential tourist. And many of those people will travel many times a year. So if you're earning $100 a day right now and you take 2 vacations a year, 25 years from now, there's a good chance you're going to be making $500 to $1,000 a day, and you may choose to make 5 to 10 vacations a year. And by vacations, I don't just mean traveling abroad. It could be going to like villages and parks and towns nearby. So the rate and acceleration of growth in tourism is stratospheric, which on the one hand is great for economic gains. But when it comes to managing tourists, I think we are only just now beginning to see what happens when this seemingly unstoppable force meets the immovable objects of destination limits. So how many people you can physically fit into a town, a city, or in the case of 2019, on Mount Everest. So what we need to do is to essentially address the fact that in a single generation, we are going to have to accommodate twice as many tourists today. Twice as many tourists as we have right now. And potentially even more than that, because if the price of travel continues to decrease, then obviously even more people will be able to travel. And this brings us to the first kind of major challenge in travel and tourism, and that's to do with measurement. And this is kind of the explanation for why I founded Equator and what it is we actually focus on doing. And that has to do with the fact that tourism has changed an enormous amount in the last 50 years, but our actual way of measuring it and understanding it really hasn't evolved at all. So we still predominantly use surveys to understand dynamics in travel and tourism. And while surveys are phenomenally good at creating accurate representations of dynamics, they aren't very well outfitted for dealing with some of the challenges of tourism. So understanding acute environmental pressures, surveys, not so great. Market volatility, yeah, they're a disaster. So they don't show what happens when Taylor Swift comes into your city. You would have to survey before and after, and then do longitudinal studies at the time. And they're also not very good at understanding hyper-localized impacts. So looking at sort of how certain parts of a city are affected, or environmental systems, or even correlations between multiple cities at the same time. Yeah, surveys are limited in this regard, and they're very expensive. So in 2019, 2020, I founded Equator with the idea of using The same type of techniques we use in humanitarian and aid work, same techniques that hedge funds and even security services use, which is to start to adapt social online content and produce essentially data layers. And we call that data bytes at Equator. And what these are essentially kind of fast, scalable micro models. They sort of simulate a dynamic in a very, very small instance. And then we algorithmically or statistically replicate them to build multiple models. So a single data byte might be composed of government data, 3D imaging, satellite imagery, accommodation listings, but it can also include, review data, metadata on social media posts on TikTok. So we are essentially scraping massive quantities of data at all times, building models, training those models, and then using those models to create representations of what's happening in travel and tourism. So for the last 4 years, we've been doing this now. We've been working with destinations, with travel companies, booking platforms to provide them with insights that help them optimize investments, manage resource allocation, even determine policy. So the idea behind data bytes is to be as sort of practical as possible, but really to build models that answer very specific, common questions in travel and tourism. So we have about 42 models built. We're always building new ones. Some of them are for fun. We don't always do them for seriousness, but we will look at weird dynamics just for to see, does it work and can we scale them? So for this presentation, I'm going to talk quite a lot about Porto. We did not work with the city of Porto for this. That was deliberate. We wanted to test if we could use data bytes and alternative data sources and AI to understand visitor flows and dynamics in Porto without any information at all that would be private from the government or get access to something that it would be, let's say, unusual. So, we spend $500,000 on booking data. It's not a fair test. So what I'm going to do now is kind of show you some samples of the data bytes, some samples of the studies and the findings, and kind of how they all work. If you have specific questions on some of these, please write them all out. I'll happily go into jump into specific models. But for the first instance, the first part of this, I want to explore essentially visitor flows and visitor dynamics within the city. And one of the first models we built was actually understanding what people talk about in the city of Porto. So where are they going and what are they doing? Now, this is essentially the mapping of the most talked about attractions. So attractions that are generating content. So people taking photos of them, people mentioning them in social media posts, on Condé Nast, on media, on web articles. We build all of that up. And then we also look at places where we're seeing concentrations of people actually visiting, so traffic influxes. So the first thing we do is just say, okay, well, where are all these attractions? Let's place them on a map. And then we add a new layer to that. So we might look at transportation maps. So how do people get around these places? Where are the bus routes? Internally, we call the transport model HOHO, which is hop on, hop off, because the hop on, hop off bus routes are one of our favorite starting points for understanding transportation of tourists. Not only do they go to the most frequented places, but they also dictate where a lot of tourists end up going because they're so easy to use. Once we've done transportation, we will start to add new elements in. So services, in this case in Porto, this is restaurants in orange, but we've also identified bars, short-term rentals, hotels, the lot, and they all get sort of layered one on top of the next, just like this. What this allows us to do and why we do this is to essentially start to identify zones and areas where there are restaurants, but not many tourists or no services for those restaurants. So if we don't see a lot of hotels or short-term rentals near some of the orange triangles, or we don't see many attractions, then we would typically associate these with being underrepresented in the travel and tourism sector, meaning they are quote unquote hidden gems. They might be not getting a lot of tourist footfall, but it might also be that they're being served by a different market. So it could be domestic tourists, it could be local Portuguese, or people living in Porto. We then essentially map these zones and go deep into them. So we'll explore, how many short-term rentals there are in a certain distance, or look at what type of restaurants are existing there. Are they fast food chains? Are they McDonald's? Are they serving local food? Even languages that are being used within these restaurants on review data. So when they are mentioned, when they appear on social media traffic, is a language being used written in English, Portuguese, German, French, etc. So it allows us to start to extrapolate dynamics and behavioral information at a really, really local level in pretty much near real time. So why do we do these things? Well, one, it allows us to understand visitor flows, patterns, behavioral preferences, online traffic, but it also allows us to understand what is essentially over tourism problems, or where we have concentrations of massive amounts of tourists at any given time. To build this model, this is probably our most data intense model. We extrapolate vast quantities of data and then we place it on a map that gets a histogram placed on it and a bar chart, and that gets layered. And so from there, we essentially identify where tourists are going and where they're not going. And then we can do that on across an entire time series, right? So we can say over time, how do our systems compare with national tourism data sets? So this was a test we ran in pretty late last year, comparing our model, which is program 4, against the national tourism data series. So you can see our model does really badly 25 years ago when we're testing on sort of retroactive data. But then when we start to get closer to time, as more social media traffic emerges, more web traffic appears, more articles get posted, we start to see how close our model is now performing against national visitor surveys, STR data, et cetera, et cetera. This was a question we had really during COVID, which was, did tourism traffic actually fundamentally change in a post-COVID world? So during COVID, a lot of us all talked about, went to tourism conferences and workshops and said, oh, we're going to build back better. We're going to do things differently. So one of the early tests we did, we said, well, did that change? Do tourists today go to places different to where they went in 2019? Unsurprisingly, the answer to this question is no. In fact, they go in even higher concentrations. So the kind of bounce back of tourists largely resulted in sort of accelerated and even more sort of exacerbated tensions in city centers. So all of this to say is that the ability for us to track in near real time means that we can actually identify patterns around events, accidents. We did a model for the Hawaii wildfires to see how it impacted the tourism sector. And we did that where we were reporting on a week by week basis impacts and dynamics, which I think were largely overlooked, which was the wildfires caused devastation to the travel and tourism industry on the surface. But when you start to pick through the data, accommodation providers, restaurants, etc., were doing not well, but they weren't doing as badly as being reported because they were now serving disaster relief services, providing refuge for people who had to leave their homes. So oftentimes when we look at kind of more traditional, sources of data, it will tell one story. You'll look at, how many tourists there are, and then you just deduct them from the total number. Using some of these systems, you kind of get a different perspective. It doesn't always work. Some of these models we build never see the light of day because they don't pass the tests. For whatever reason, which might be the data not accurate enough, we don't have enough quantity. We do struggle in, parts of Africa, for example, and in certain languages. But for OECD countries, it's been, almost uniformly good. So another really cool part of this is brand new. We haven't released this, so it is a little underbaked. So apologies for this, but I did want to include it, which is we're starting to look at patterns in cities and infrastructure and supply side economics to see, are there certain cities that are susceptible to over tourism and their dynamics? So this graph is a benchmark of supply side distribution. So it's really complicated to look at, I think, on the first surface, but the diamond shapes on the left-hand side, you can imagine the city center. That's right in the middle of the city center where the kind of single point where all tourists meet. The size of the diamond represents the number of businesses and their proximity to that city center. So in the case of Venice on the left, that huge diamond you're seeing, that is because there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of very small tourism businesses, all highly concentrated in a single area. And the little bump towards the end of Venice, that's the mainland city. So the reason there's a bump there is because there are also short-term rentals, restaurants, etc., being set up now on the mainland, not just in the historic island. What is really fascinating to us is that when you start to like build these systems across hundreds of cities, you can actually see that there are some cities like Porto that look quite similar to Venice in their shape. And right now, I would say that's probably a bad thing. In early evidence seems to suggest that Porto seems to be going the way of Venice in that the high degrees of concentration of tourists in one place and tourist establishments and the supply side would indicate to us that they are susceptible for crowding out of locals, of having sort of a homogenization of tourism businesses. So, you'll get 25 restaurants on a single street to serve the 500 short-term rentals on that street, the 10 hotels, et cetera, et cetera. One of my favorite places in the world, not just to visit, but also to look at data is Switzerland. And the reason Switzerland's so fascinating is that from a data perspective, it's incredibly boring. The Swiss have this ability to produce, dynamics and systems and models that when you look at them, you go, that is incredibly flat. You don't see a lot of outliers. You don't see a lot of bizarre dynamics. And this was a really fascinating one for us, which is across all the Swiss cities we've analyzed, Zurich is the most exciting, quote unquote, from a data point of view, and it's not very exciting. It's very, very little sort of marks Swiss cities out as being at risk of something or being outliers of something, with the exception of like price of hostels or price of coffees. But the distribution of their tourism sectors, tourism providers across their cities is almost uniform. And that is fascinating because what it really seems to point to is that that is kind of where you want to be. The Swiss cities cannot be said to be suffering from over tourism. And I think they're a really good example for kind of the benchmarks we should be looking for if we're trying to avoid overcrowding, if we're worried about, sort of concentrations or crowding out of locals. This I will add though is it's still fairly early. The most complex and intense system we built in the last 12 months has been on short-term rentals. So I did this because I was annoyed, I think, last year. I read an article by Wired talking about the Airbnb apocalypse in New York. And I felt like it was a fairly dramatic response to the regulations that were being put in place. And so we wanted to see, can we understand the extent to which short-term rentals are actually a problem in a city? And on the surface, I think from a short-term rental point of view, it would initially be, so I should go back. On the surface, short-term rentals, you just say how many short-term rentals are there in a city? It doesn't really work because in the case of like Vienna, for example, you have more short-term rentals in Vienna than you do in Venice. But Vienna doesn't have the kind of short-term rental crisis that Venice does. So what we had to do in developing a model to identify the pressure and the sort of problems that short-term rentals might cause was to look at about 27 different data systems and then build a massive entire model. We actually got it going in New York here. So what you're looking at is buildings at every block level. So this is a 3D spatial rendering of the city of New York. And then we looked at local population density in each one of these buildings or blocks. And then we overlaid short-term rental listings and their occupancy estimates. And then we put hotel data on top of that. And then we built an index. And the index we used was benchmarked off of Venice because we said, okay, well, we need to find a very clear problem city, which is Venice. And Venice looks a bit like this. So yellow means there are 35 to 40 short-term rentals or more in a block. Green means there are, somewhere between 20 and 35, and then below green towards blue, you're getting down to 0. Dark blue means there are still occasional, potentially short-term rentals, 1 or 2 there, but very, very few. The dark blue is fine, shouldn't worry about anything. Yellow is Venice level problems. And what's really cool about this is we started to expand it across city after city. So we obviously built one for Porto, and that perfectly correlates to where you see tourism traffic, which is highly concentrated in one location. And again, coming back to like my benchmarking piece, that mirrors exactly what we would expect to find. But our big surprise was Oslo, which was Oslo actually has some degree of short-term rental issues. Not to say that they should immediately start licensing or regulating them or, putting them under constrictions, but what it allows us to say is, well, you do seem to have pressure in one form or another that is likely impacting either your long-term leases and rental markets, or alternatively may affect, perception among people that this is in fact a problem. Then we built another one. This is recent. We haven't released this yet. This is still in testing, but tests are going well. And this is around the extent to which over-tourism and crowds are actually negatively impacting visitor perception and brand reputation. I spoke to quite a few CEOs over the last year, and they said they are not remotely worried about over-tourism, and they will continue to send tourists to the same places because that's where they want to go. Fair enough, but I warned them and continue to warn others. I think data is beginning to say that tourists do care. And you could start at a very tertiary level and say, well, are they searching for things like over tourism? Yes, massively. It's a big topic this year or last year. But the bigger thing, though, is that places like the Mona Lisa are beginning to see actual review scores being impacted. So when we compared the months of June between 2017 and 2024, we saw a total reduction of 20% for that month. And this is after they put in the cap. And the primary reason people are dissatisfied is to do with facility staff and concerns over pickpocketing and the time spent queuing. These are directly related to crowds and over tourism issues. And we have begun testing on multiple attractions. We did the same thing at Blue Lagoon. In high season, they're seeing a 10% drop year on year. And say what you want, if your products and your experiences are getting negative reviews, that is a brand and marketing problem. And tourists have no hesitation, no problem at all, giving a hotel a 3 or 2-star review if they feel the municipality is not collecting trash from outside that hotel. So a little bit like Uber Eats and restaurants, which is restaurants can serve food for delivery. And if the delivery driver takes an hour to get to your house, you might leave a 1-star review on the restaurant, which it wasn't the restaurant's fault that the delivery driver took a break or got lost or whatever. But tourists or visitors, consumers are ruthless in their reviews. And if they feel associated with over-tourism, that they're having a negative experience as a result of it, they will leave a negative review. And so I think as tourists continue to increase and the dynamics don't change, if things continue to go in the same direction they're going, then I would likely expect this to accelerate massively. And increasingly, I think we're going to start to see tourists over the next couple of years begin to select destinations because they don't have crowds. It will become a driver of decision making. That's some of the stuff that we are kind of jumping into. This brings me to a conclusion, and I think sort of AI's most underrated feature, which is without doubt its most boring, and that is data cleaning. When I started Equator in 2021, we were building these models and this data byte system and layering system for clients. And, we were charging not exorbitant amounts of money, but it wasn't cheap to do this. And the large part of that came down to cleaning data. Extracting, testing systems was extraordinarily expensive for us at Equator. So we would spend huge amounts of time, the data scientists would, poring over massive quantities of data and identifying patterns, testing, learning, to really just process that data in a certain way that mean that we could use it for insights or analytics. As LLMs started to come on board and vector-based search became more prevalent, the cost of those things has dropped by about 90%. And the reason I get really excited about this is as those costs decrease, this is kind of my optimistic side coming in out a bit here, is I think the challenges of 21st century tourism, particularly on the data side, are going to be much more easily met. And the primary reason is that AI is going to facilitate sort of near real-time insights. We'll be able to sort of get information that would have taken a month to process or 3 weeks to process. We'll be able to start processing it within hours or even minutes. It also enables us to start looking at sort of local systems at a much deeper level. So because we can do huge quantities of data in a very short space of time, by building sort of more complex models, we can start to understand local dynamics in a way that was never possible before. So villages, towns, national parks, even restaurants, like, some of the work we do is with companies, investor groups, and they will go really, really deep on dynamics. How many pizzerias are there within a 1 kilometer radius that are serving Chicago style pizza? We can get into that. And it's fascinating because these things used to cost tens of thousands of dollars per report. We can now do them as continual systems. And all of that to say is that the price, the computational costs and time involved have massively reduced. And this is kind of the part of AI that just has really gone under the radar in almost all the media, which is the ability of using large language models to take unstructured data, massive bodies of text, billions of reviews, comments, news articles, and extrapolate that down into machine readable data points is phenomenal. So as Edmund is Equator, we don't do anything on the chatbot, agent side, customer side at all. We purely look at insights and data and market intelligence. And this is the part that I get really excited about. It makes me super nerdy. I'm not good at parties, but I will massively enjoy I sort of thought 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, these insights, and they're sort of at their worst they will be. So 5 years from now, I think we'll really start to be able to see the power of utility in using online content, alternative data sources to understand tourism dynamics in a way that's completely new. So with
Edmund.
that, I promised Rachel I would do Q&A. So yes.
Yes. Oh, well, I was actually going to slightly butt in because it was such a relevant question to your slide. This is absolutely fascinating, Edmund, and I love this slide actually about, the prediction of us being able to meet challenges with data solutions, because this is something we talk about all the time. And there's actually a question from Polona, who's a research analyst with Ljubljana Tourism. So great to have you on the webinar, Polona. Nice to see you again. Her question was about the data sources, because she was saying, where do you get it from? Is it all public, or do you have to buy some of it in?
We haven't bought any to date. We bought some for testing about 2 years ago. And that was to buy external data. So when you get to that point where you're just, okay, well, how many more tests can we do? When you get really local dynamics, we had to buy for testing. But no, the models themselves are all built on stuff that can scale. So one of the rules we have at Equator is if we can't build a scalable model, so a model that applies almost uniformly, city by city, town by town, country by country, we don't do it. We don't build bespoke models unless clients essentially pay us for advisory services to do that. The way in which we approach this is that the data sources we're using are massively varied. It depends a lot on what we're analyzing. But the most common ones would be, we always do supply side infrastructure. So everything to do with where businesses are, what type of business they are they established or not, we will extract from the web. And that might be going website by website at times. But then we'll look at review data. We'll look at metadata on social media traffic, geopings. It really is varied, but we don't do geofencing, for example. We don't buy mobile phone data. We don't buy credit card data. We thought about it for a while, but it was about $500,000, I think, was the price we were quoted for what we needed. And we don't do surveys. So I have done surveys in the past. I've managed surveys in the past, but the Equator, no, the whole purpose was really to kind of make it affordable and to make it scalable and practical. So the nature of that meant we had to look at sources that were different to everything else. And the nice part was as well, while we were building the system, MIT and Griffith University and hundreds of others, particularly in actually India, fascinatingly, and some in Amsterdam and Netherlands, have been publishing analysis on similar uses for alternative data. So I think it's a growing industry, but in tourism, it's relatively nascent. If you look at hedge funds and big investment groups, private equity, I mentioned intelligence services because I know my friends in DoD, they do this a lot more than they do in tourism. So I think I think for tourism, it's a growing space, but I think the industry writ large is still primarily using surveys.
Yes, well, actually, that kind of segues very nicely into the second part of Polona's question, which was about can you differentiate between foreign visitors, local residents, or people who are from the next town over, or something like that? Are you able to do that?
So we never identify a tourist. So we never look at a user. We're not, and we never will. So we are not going to look at this and say, can we identify, Jen from Village A going to Village B? Um, Not just for GDPR issues, but also because I think it's technically very, very hard to do and ethically questionable. But when it comes to understanding languages, like, where a tourist from, this has been a really fascinating system for us, and one where it may require us to really build fine-tuned models for each country. So I can give you a kind of practical case study for this. Americans use Yelp a lot. In Europe, not so much. And Europeans are much more likely going to make comments or leave reviews on TripAdvisor or Google, or on the website or on, whoever their supplier was. Americans will be much more likely to use Yelp than anyone else. And so when we see reviews on Yelp in English, and then we see different reviews on, let's say, Google, for example, we're going to essentially map those two dynamics and say it's much more likely that the person on Yelp is American or lives in America. So that's one example. The obvious examples are then obviously languages. If someone's posting in a certain language, um, that's generally another indicator. On social media traffic, Instagram posts and that sort of thing, then yes, again, it's possible to identify. The extent to which there's a correlation, though, between international visitor surveys about inbound tourists and flight data, and comparing that with traffic we see on online content, that's probably, I would love to get to that next year, 2026, but I already know because we did test it, how big a job it is. We would have to do, that is where a scenario we'd have to buy flight data. We'd have to buy a lot of data and probably have to find a partnership with Google while we're at it as well. Because just the volume of data would have to analyze, the difference between domestic and foreign is pretty complex. But that was a very long answer. Apologies.
No, that's absolutely. Thank you. There's no open questions. Did you want to carry on with some more slides, Edmund, or are we discussing now? What would you prefer?
I'm happy. I don't have any like pre-prepared slides for this one. I deliberately kept this shorter. I have hundreds of examples of these things, so I'm more than happy to pull up some other snapshots of like tourism dynamics. But I think if I'm going to sort of like jump into a few other topics, I think some of the things that I would expect to see in sort of like generally in the travel and tourism space, and the reason I think particularly on the over tourism side, and like why I think sort of crowds are an increasing issue, particularly 2025, is that the idea that over tourism sentiment is going to decrease, or that the crowds and protests are going to lessen and drop off, I am thoroughly unconvinced by that argument. It is there in the travel and tourism space. I cannot imagine why that's going to take place. But I would also come around to the point that one thing that really does concern me about travel and tourism moving forward is, and we are seeing this in some destinations, that tourists are being blamed for things that they are not responsible for. I think Airbnb is a really good example of this. Airbnb can cause short-term rental and long-term rental issues, but it is being, people are pointing fingers at short-term rental companies and platforms where they should not be doing so. It's a failure of government, it's a failure of the industry, broadly speaking, that's causing that. And I think what we will see more of is, as anti-tourism sentiment grows, governments, municipalities, companies will say, hey, it's not our fault, it's someone else's fault. And I think tourists will be blamed for that, because they don't vote. And if you don't vote, then it doesn't matter, you know, what a tourist thinks of you. You're not worried about their opinion. You're worrying about winning the next election. And so I think if things get worse, if housing shortages remain in place, if inflation continues, if cost of living continues to be a problem, then I think it's very likely we will see anti-tourist sentiment get worse, not better. And and again, I don't know if the tourism industry is talking about this enough. I think they're still sort of thinking that they are sort of 1990s tourists. You know, we're great for economies, great for locals, great for everyone. It's a win-win-win. I'm not sure in a sort of next 10, 15, 20 years that's going to be the case. I think and then this is why, like in terms of the management of tourism, I think if you are a small city, well, national governments, or particularly a large city, then managing tourism flows is going to be an absolute critical endeavor. Um, Licensing, regulations, zoning, investment, the lot. It's going to be a huge task.
And
But yeah, so that will be my piece there.
no, well, that is something that, we do raise quite a bit in our policy work, is this idea of sort of um, demonizing the tourist for things that are really inherent infrastructure problems within a city. But one thing that we've touched on in our conversations in the past, Edmund, related to this is, can we use these models for policy and governance scenarios? I mean, is it possible that if I say I'm a policymaker in a city that may have an issue with this, and I'm thinking, okay, I want to implement some kind of restriction on short-term rentals, or I want to change the time that major attractions are open, or something like that? Do you think we would be able to extrapolate these models to try to model the impact of these policies?
Yeah, I mean that's really the reason we built them. So the some of them we built for experimentation, but a lot of the models we have at Equator, some of which I can't share or don't share, because they're behind paywalls. But they're used for policy, for research, for the big ones are investors. Investors purchase access to them to understand. If I put a hotel here, how much money am I going to make? The zoning questions, the short-term rental one is yes, we're discussing this with several destinations now to say, okay, we can, yeah, and more broadly speaking, I'll come into this in a second, but each individual model has its own price. So you can just purchase and download a single data set, the maps, and some brief analysis. But the plan essentially is to actually just create this as a licensed platform where you would hop online, log in, and then you would get access to all the models and all the contents for every city on the platform. So, and again, I come back to that. We just launched this for tour operators recently. It's a carbon calculator that estimates emissions and produces benchmarks for your tours and hundreds of others. And it only costs $1 a tour. And this kind of gives you some idea of like pricing and how it's going to move forward. This used to cost us $400 to measure the emissions of a tour. We've got it down to $1. And I think it will continue to get cheaper and more accurate. I think the idea for us as Equator is to essentially turn this into a single market intelligence platform where you could explore Venice and see dynamics of travel and tourists in Venice, even if you are, I don't know, Amsterdam, and then jump into Singapore 5 minutes later and see how traveler flows move in Singapore and see what they're doing, etc. Because right now, if you look at data and travel and tourism, it's massively disparate. It's very difficult to access. It's very difficult to understand. It's hidden behind sort of 200-page reports, which makes it really difficult to discover what works in one city, or a dynamic that's occurring in one place versus your hometown. So yeah, I mean the general idea is that we are going, well, the general idea, what we are doing is we build a platform for operators that's going to continue to expand. And then these models I've shown here, within the next few months, we'll begin building this for destination industry platform partners. So we'll be onboarding our existing clients to the system. And then if anyone is interested in getting access to this, please do message me after this, email me, tell me I would like access to it, because yeah, the whole purpose behind building it is essentially just onboard people and give them access to the data.
Well, I would say as an extension of that, Edmund, is I think one thing that I think is really interesting about what AI is doing here is it's making this accessible to much smaller organizations than it would have done in the past, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that is the part for us that, again, so much of data analytics comes back to cleaning and like extraction, transformation, loading, ETL. And it's boring and it's dull, but it is incredibly powerful. And I think if you're getting that ability to take a large quantity of data and make it affordable and accessible. We did one for the government of Panama about a year ago. They wanted to understand the economic impact of adventure travel, but it's a nascent industry in Panama. And one of the points of the minister was like, how do we identify businesses in this sector? We don't have census data for these areas. We don't know who's operating in the space. It's very hard for us to find them. Well, one advantage of our system is that we'll find them because people are going to post, photos of hiking trails where they are. They're going to comment. They're going to go to review websites. They're going to talk about it on Reddit. And by extracting all that data, we were able to identify several hundred businesses that are operating in Panama in the adventure travel space, and then built an economic model out of that. About a month after the report was finalized, I met with the minister and was chatting to his head of licensing. She was furious at me because she said, we checked the license department. Of the 280 something businesses you identified, 200 don't exist. They're not on our books. They're not on our records. We have no history of them. And I was very apologetic. It was a deeply painful moment. And about a week later, I got a call from her and saying, oh no, we actually drove out and found them all. And what was essentially happened is they just weren't licensing as tourism businesses. They were licensing as NGOs. They were licensing as, different businesses not under the tourism department, because there was no adventure travel license. There wasn't a division in the department for this space. So they didn't know how to license at all, or they were just operating informally. And so I think for the utility of that data and for like its application and the systems, it's going to get so much faster and easier to extrapolate this information and then analyze it and present it to villages, towns, and broader clients. And so this is where I do get excited, is that it won't be McKinsey level pricing in 5 years from now. It won't be, you need $500,000 to understand tourist perception. It'll be, even from Equator's point of view, our pricing for our tour operators starts at $100 a year, and our destination pricing starts at $10,000 per year for all data. So you get access to everything. And that, when you compare that to, how much you would have to pay to access one city and one report, it'd be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's where I think, it's going to get cheaper, faster, and easier. And, parks, ski resorts, etc., will be able to get access to us for a few $1,000. And that's the optimistic part. That means I think planning should get better, regulation, investment, etc. Hopefully.
Yes, well, let's hope so. Just something else that I had actually forgotten we had chatted about earlier this morning, which I think would be great to just squeeze in a little bit, talking about kind of the power of this and destination management. We spoke a bit about homogenization of supply this morning, and I just thought that, I think that would be really interesting for the audience to hear what's going on in that. And I know it's quite new and it's not sort of ready, but it would be great to just maybe chat a little bit about that, because I think it's a really interesting way forward.
Yeah, okay. So this is a model we began working on in October. And the idea was this. If you are, where did we do it for? Oh, we did it for Florence, that's the one. So that we started with Florence, and we were looking, it was an Instagram post that triggered this. Someone on Instagram was commenting that, their city was being ruined because this entire street was just now comprised of places selling paninis. And so we immediately called the model Panini. And what we were trying to then do is say, okay, can we see how many businesses are selling the same service, same thing, the same menu in a particular area? And do we see a pattern in that data over history? So as tourists grow, and as let's say this was the case about Atlantico in Florence, it blew up on social media. That resulted in investors saying, okay, let's pump money into this. People like Paninis in Florence, let's go after it. The Florentine government may also decide, we're gonna boost it, we're gonna promote it, we're gonna get people to Florence for this purpose. Suddenly then there's a surge. There's a trend, people jump on the trend, investors say there's an opportunity to make money here. Let's create our own panini stores. And we even saw we took imaging of a kebab place turning into a kebab and panini place. And what this essentially is, from an economic point of view, is you're seeing a homogenization of services within an area. And that is transforming both the authenticity and identity of the place. But it also means that place is now exposed to economic risk. Because if you're no longer serving multiple different things and people get bored of panini one day, or, it is just the case that, I don't know, there's a bug in the food and it makes everyone sick, then a lot of businesses will go under, and it'll be hard to kind of recover quickly. There were other aspects to homogenization as well, which we were testing and still are in Jordan, where Jordanian food, so not Levantine food. So there's like Lebanese, Levantine, and Ottoman food. Then there's Jordanian. There are almost no Jordanian restaurants serving traditional heritage food. It's all Levantine. So hummus, meze style dishes. But the heritage food of Jordan is being lost because the 5-star, 4-star, 3-star restaurants are not serving it. And it's not available in hotels. If you ask for it, it's not known about. And it's falling out of the sort of lexicon and content available online. Even if you search for it, you've gone Food Atlas, there's things like 1 or 2 dishes. There should be about 150. And what we're able to tell about the homogenization here is that as tourism businesses pop up, as the tourism industry grows, you want to serve things to people. Well, if everyone is serving the same thing, we're beginning to see patterns, and that results in CEOs saying, well, that's what people want. And it's not, because people want it because it's the only thing being offered to them. And that is where I think we almost have the chicken and egg problem, supply and demand, where if all you provide is one thing, not only you expose yourself to risk, but you're also making massive assumptions on the tourist. And I think same thing in operators. We do this with the tour operators and the companies on our platform. We map all routes of thousands of tours simultaneously. A lot of operators tell us, Ed, we sell these things because it's where our tourists want to go. Well, okay, but 98% of the tours sold in Iceland go to the same places. So, you're worried about over tourism, you're worried about crowds, go somewhere else. Like, there's plenty of places to visit in Iceland, but you're all selling the same thing. And essentially, one of the nice parts about the data is you get to see how different your product is, where you're going, what you're selling, and also, how do you differentiate yourself? So, you can look at menu design in restaurants now and say, one of the things we did as a one-off model, this is for a client in Jordan, was we looked at menu design and said how many of the 5-star, 4-star restaurants are serving the same 10 dishes, and it was all of them. And in order to differentiate themselves, they just changed the entire menu. And I think that is very exciting, but it's also a kind of hidden dynamic in tourism, which we don't talk a huge amount about. The influx of demand results in a change in supply, which then in turn can have pretty negative consequences on what's actually being offered.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one for the future, probably.
Yeah, yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I should say that model will come out. We'll start talking about that probably like 3-4 months from now. So we're going to start releasing videos and insights, sort of newsletters into this stuff as well. So we'll kind of like do little mini publications about like insights and learnings we're finding. But yes, I'm excited about that one because I think it tells a very clear story about sort of like opportunities for market differentiation.
Yep, absolutely. And we've got one final question, which is from Marco Durivo of Mickey Travel, which I think is quite a good one to finish on, actually, because we've looked at all these amazing things that we can achieve with AI and data. His question was, what do you think are the limitations of it, or areas where it wouldn't be useful, or it might be actually the opposite of useful? Are there any areas like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, GDP. If you're an economist, don't use this data. So like if your job is to measure the contributions of tourism to GDP, if you're Oxford Economics or Deloitte or PwC, do not use this. I mean, do if you do tons and tons and tons of testing on it, but if you are purely trying to look at kind of classical IVS, MBS systems, by that I mean, the tourism satellite accounts, I would never use this system. Because it isn't built for that. It's built to understand dynamics in tourism that are more practical than economic ones. Where I would also not use this system, where would I not use this system? It's a difficult question because it's sort of, I haven't encountered a scenario yet where I can unequivocally tell you, other than the economic case, that it definitively would never work. I when we do encounter scenarios where it often comes down to like we don't have enough data. So I'll give you an example here, which is like the carbon emission model we built. We were measuring carbon emissions of tours in real time, and we found that, if like vehicles break down and stuff, you can underreport your emissions. You can have sort of like 1, 2, 3, 4% issues with emissions reporting. So in those instances, like, if you're going to get audited for something, so where you want to be hyper accurate and know precisely the carbon amount, then yeah, I would say these systems aren't designed for auditable individual transactional level understandings, right? So they're designed to be indicative, dynamic, and trend analysis around behavior, perception, investment. They're not built to say, actually, a really interesting one we've been looking at is local economic spend. How much money stays in local economy? That's hard. And that is my area of expertise. That has been really difficult. And we continue to struggle to use this system for that purpose. Every time we do it, we have to build a bespoke model. So it kind of defeats the purpose. We end up just doing essentially what traditional consultants would do anyway. So it's possible you can add layers to it. It can add nuance to that visitor spend piece. But if you're looking at spillover, I would still use traditional systems.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's a very pertinent point, actually, Edmund, about measuring economic leakage, because that is such an important part of the sustainability debate, isn't it? And I think it would be an enormous undertaking to try to do that. It's such a complex kind of area. But I would be hopeful it might be somewhere we would get to further down the line, because it's something that is a really important indicator really for the business. Well, we have no more open questions, and we're pretty much on our time. So I think with that, I'll just remind you all, if you haven't been to the Insight Hub, etoa.org/insight, you'll find this webinar and all of our other ones, along with lots of reports on there as well. So have a look. And Edmund, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I hope it was useful. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, if anyone wants access to the data, please message me. So if you want to see anything or have questions you didn't ask in chat, let me know.
Absolutely. And if you can't find Edmund for some reason, contact us and we're happy to help as well. So I wish you all a pleasant day, and thanks again, Edmund. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Cheers.